Good morning, colleagues. Welcome to this second webinar in the UNDAF webinar series. Today we will be talking about United Nations Development Assistance Frameworks in crisis and complex country situations. My name is Frederick Matis. I'm the regional advisor here in DOCO, and I'm very pleased to have two great presentations ahead of us. We will start with the common country analysis in Palestine, which Robert Piper will be delivering for us. Robert is the Deputy Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, the Resident Coordinator and the Humanitarian Coordinator in Palestine. And then we will be going to John Hedenstrom, the Senior Planning and Coordination Advisor of the UN Resident Coordinator's Office in Lebanon. You might have seen in the UNDAF guidance, and if you have not seen it yet, we will be distributing this probably sometime next week. We're currently, it's being layouted by the colleagues. So you should be able to get this next week, and you will see that one of the 6 key enablers is talking about humanitarian development and peace building linkages. While this text is quite aspirational, we thought it was always great to listen to a specific example. So we're very pleased to have 2 great examples of colleagues who actually already have done this in practice, and I believe they're 2 great examples. And they also quite fit well together, starting with the CCA and then how they have developed the UN strategic framework in Lebanon. So I will not take too much time from you, but before I give the floor to Robert, a couple of practical issues. You will see on your screen a box where you can put your questions. Feel free to already add your questions during this presentation. Once the presentations are done, we will be having a series of Q&A. It would be useful if you can add your name and your duty station so we can kind of place where the question is coming from. And I will then read those questions out loud for everybody and for Robert and John to answer after their presentations. So you should see that box of questions. We might also launch a poll at the end of this webinar. And then you can just fit in the answer that you think fits best. So with that, I will now give the floor to Robert, who will be starting his presentation on the UN Common Country Analysis for Palestine. And Robert, I think you have muted yourself, so if you can unmute yourself, then we're ready to go. The floor is yours. Robert,
okay. Thank you very much, Frederick, and good morning, good evening, good afternoon to everyone online, wherever you may be. Thank you for an opportunity to share, just in 10 minutes, my CCA story, as it were, in Palestine, and maybe a little bit about Nepal leading back, but thanks for the chance. Let me just start by sort of emphasizing, for me, how passionate I am about the CCA. I can't exaggerate the importance I attach to this. This is our analysis. The UNDAF is something we have to do jointly with the government. It's full of compromises of an interagency kind or a government kind. This is our analysis. It's really our chance to find our voice as a system. And it's a chance, a very rare chance, every 5 years for most of us, to talk through as a team, as the UN country team, really, what is the glue that holds us together? What are the underpinnings of what we're doing together, and how are we going to go about it? It's really a critical opportunity to reflect together on how we're approaching the development landscape in front of us. Some people, I think typically the CCA is undervalued in terms of its importance. It's either subcontracted or just done in a very kind of tokenistic way, and it drives me crazy to see that happen. Others feel that, look, the National Development Plan sets out the issues, and why would why do we need to substitute for that? We're led by the government after all. But I have to say, for me, it's not clear to me how we could automatically substitute our CCA analysis for a government plan. When I look around at the CCAs I've read and the country experiences, I think of Tunisia in the lead up to the Arab Spring and the anger that was revealed in that period, and I asked myself why that CCA for Tunisia somehow didn't address what was brewing. I think of a number of CCAs in Nigeria, maybe, that have been done over the years that didn't necessarily signal what was going to come in front of us in northeast Nigeria that we're seeing today. Or a CCA for Haiti that made no reference to the earthquake that was going to change the development trajectory of Haiti in a matter of about a minute and a half. For me, these were huge missed opportunities for the UN system to put its cards on the table and to say, very frankly, these are the key development issues on the horizon for this country based on what we know about it. Huge, huge missed opportunities. That's, for me, why the CCA is so important. And if it's a good CCA, therefore, it's probably an uncomfortable set of analysis, i.e. it's not going to fit neatly. It's not going to reflect, mirror the analysis that comes in a national development plan. I don't say it has to be controversial. I certainly don't encourage people to go out and court controversy. But if you're getting at the difficult issues, it's not going to be comfortable analysis. If you're talking, as we do here in Palestine, and as you should in many other countries, about who is being left behind, then the fact is that some of the analysis has got to be uncomfortable, or you're probably kind of missing the point. So for me, in a nutshell, the CCA is as much a kind of broad statement of intent of what we stand for, as it is also, and I'll come back to that very specifically, basically your M&E baseline on which your UNDAF will be built. Because for me, in the CCA, in the analysis you do, you are also explicitly saying this is the baseline against which we want to be judged over the next 5 years. So come back to us after this next UNDAF and let's revisit whether the issues that we framed in this CCA, whether they were indeed addressed in the UNDAF that followed. What does this all imply? It implies, as I said, firstly, that it isn't easily substituted with a government development plan. It also implies that you can't contract this work out. I mean, A, it's a missed opportunity. B, it's a false economy to kind of hire a couple of consultants and send them off with some terms of reference to come back with 10 chapters on the typical kind of CCA analysis. This is a missed opportunity to bring the team together, but you really have to, if you're dealing with sensitive issues, you have to wrestle with them together. C, you can't delegate this to sectoral agencies, and this is again the typical CCA where every chapter is being given to a different agency and it is sectorally organized, and this absolutely does not, it sort of misses the point in my opinion. D, it's very hard, let me say this very clearly, it is hard to do a good CCA in a country team that is very new, with a new RC or a very, with a country team that hasn't developed too many kind of strong interagency muscles. This is definitely, if you're going to embark on a good CCA, you need that sort of emotional space and maturity as a team to be able to debate and talk through the different implications. So that for me is setting the stage. I don't think everyone, I'm not going to go into huge detail about what we discovered in the Palestine one, but for me that's to set the stage. And so let me then just give you a brief overview with the help of a few slides about how we did it in Palestine, and it's very similar to how we did it in Nepal, I guess 5 or 6 years ago now, maybe a bit longer. If we just turn first to the next slide, please, Frederick. Should say vulnerability and disadvantage. Thank you. I think first we had to agree on an approach as a UN country team. If it's not going to be a set of traditional chapter headings given one to FAO, the next to WHO, the next to UNICEF, how are we going to do this? And we agreed, I stress well before Agenda 2030 and SDGs were blessed, that we wanted to look at the issue of vulnerability and structural disadvantage, i.e. we wanted to understand through the CCA which parts of Palestinian society are somehow not getting a fair share of the development progress. Who's being left behind? We didn't have that language at the beginning because we didn't have Agenda 2030, but as it happens, it's exactly the same question that's being asked of the SDGs, which is great. Aggregate numbers can look okay, but we want to see the quality of that progress. So we framed this around the issue of structural disadvantage, who's sort of systematically not getting a fair share, and then also vulnerability. So the prospects that for those where where they have achieved certain progress, where that progress is perhaps more at risk of erosion than others. So we had to agree as a team what was the framing of this, what were we attempting to do, and this was not easy because these questions. The idea that we would organize ourselves around vulnerability and structural disadvantage, for some of our members in the country team, sounded a little bit too narrow, sounded a bit too NGO-ish. You know, what about the economy, stupid? What about the big infrastructure stuff? Are you sure, coming at this from such a sort of people-centered approach, are we going to capture the full breadth and depth of the UN development system? This was no easy kind of discussion at the very outset, although the SDG debate in a sense helped a lot to get us across the line. Though again, with a good country team, you can talk these things through and you can debate them and you can come out the other side. And we were indeed making that progress. I'm privileged in the kind of people that I have in Palestine in the country team. Then we had to identify, well, on what basis are we going to do this analysis? So the exercise, which was similar also in Nepal, and if we could go to the next slide, please, Frederick, was to actually ask the UN country team members to identify who do you think is vulnerable in Palestinian society? Which groups of people seem to be more consistently left behind than others? Now, again, for me, it was a great opportunity, and I did the same in Nepal, of letting the agencies speak for themselves. An open question. You don't have to, just because you're WHO, you don't need to only talk about the health. If you have a group that you may have a sister who's disabled and you feel that disability is a huge issue in Palestinian society. Great. Make the case. You don't have to be a head of agency. We really wanted to open it up to the full membership of the UN Development Group in Palestine or in Nepal and say, tell us, who do you think are being left behind? And back your claim with some empirical evidence. And on that basis, we can proceed with our analysis. So as in Nepal, as in Palestine, we got lots and lots of groups, a lot more than we could handle analytically. There was lots of duplication. There were some that were very, very small and too small in a way, others that were way too big that didn't give us, you know, women as a group is sort of such a large unit of analysis. It was almost too difficult to work with. The whole of Gaza was another suggestion by many people. So you have to, as a group, really work through the vulnerable groups that are proposed as your analytical kind of framework, and figure out which are the best ones that work. But again, this is quite democratic. This is coming from our members, and there are gaps in these, and that's life as well. If we don't have a champion or any knowledge about certain groups, then we have to live with that and work with what we've got. Third step then is to unpack those vulnerable groups, is what we did, and we looked for patterns to understand what might explain why these groups are consistently being left behind. And of course, it can be a different explanation for each group. And you've got a list here of 20 that we ended up with in Palestine. It's a different group, for example, to the group we had in Nepal. I mean, there's a couple of commonalities, but by no means many, I would say, which is interesting. So we looked at what the patterns behind these groups, and again, there's some overlap. Some of them share similar issues. Some of them, are unique in terms of their issues. And from there, we then unpacked to define what were the drivers, if you will, of this vulnerability and disadvantage. What's behind this? We're looking at the symptoms now. It's clear that adolescent girls, say, consistently falling behind in terms of access to, say, the economy and economic assets. So the time is to look behind and try and figure out what's going on here. What's the explanation? And again, you've got to have a strong country team. You need some, we used some consultants to do some of the drafting, absolutely, some of the writing, but we had a very robust group of both at the working level and UN team of this working group, but then also we kept coming back to the UNCT level to have discussions about how do you distinguish between a symptom and a cause, what's behind this. And these are the sorts of discussions that are incredibly enriching for a UN country team. I mean, the process leaves you so much stronger for it if you do it right. We ended up with in a sense, 6 drivers. You've got 5 on your screen. The big driver of vulnerability, which I didn't even mention here, but the first half of our CCA is basically saying everyone in Palestine is vulnerable because they're living under military occupation. That may seem very obvious, but trying to unpack what that means was very important for us to document, and generated a tremendous amount of debate also and some tension with the Israeli government. But we documented over 50 pages how systematically vulnerable every Palestinian is from all walks of life. And that was the first answer to the question. The second answer to the question was, okay, if we set aside for a minute that broad statement that all Palestinians are vulnerable, and incidentally, this is an integral part of our UNDAF design. If we set that aside, then beyond that, how do we distinguish, how do we explain the fact that nevertheless, some Palestinians still seem to be much more vulnerable than others, even though we agree everyone from all walks of life is to some extent touched by the occupation and vulnerable as a result. So we came up with these 5 drivers. I won't go into them in great detail, but just one sentence on each. I mean, the first is where you live, the locational issue. It turns out where you live has a direct, very clear bearing on the degree to which you're in one of these vulnerable, you're a vulnerable person or not in Palestine. And here it is linked to a great extent with the occupation, because in Palestine it's cut up depending on the security arrangements and the peace arrangements with the Israelis. So in some areas you can't access healthcare because of the Israeli permit regime and so forth. So the first variable was a locational one. And similarly, incidentally, in Nepal, for very different reasons, if you're living in a very remote corner of Nepal, that's going to be a big explainer of your vulnerability. The second one in Palestine was around the exposure you had to violence. Here, of course, it's a lot to do, again, with the occupation. Violence is something that naturally comes with the occupation, and some people are more exposed to it than others. But there's other violence too, we found, the social violence, domestic violence in the home, violence in schools, violence in communities, settler violence, different kinds of violence, which we felt were very important explanation for why some people find themselves in a very different trajectory than others. The third area, and now I've lost my, I've lost my screen. The third area is, sorry. The third area was around economic access to assets. So we found that a big variation from one group to another in terms of who's got access to economic assets or not, who you're married to, what are your connections, what are your political connections, and so forth. These sorts of things had a lot of bearing. What was your dependency rate in your family, how many dependent children versus the breadwinner, etc. These sorts of things were a big indicator. The fourth, and you can see this is getting more and more sensitive as you go down my list, the fourth was around institutional and political influence, if you will. Some vulnerable groups were clearly less visible in the policy-making realm than others. Some, there's very little data because no one's really looking for it. Some are clearly falling between the cracks in terms of legislation and so forth. Some really neglected groups in terms of lawmaking by politicians and so forth. And the fifth and the most sensitive of the drivers we came up with was around socio-cultural attitudes and prejudice, if you will. Attitudes towards girls inheriting in families, attitudes towards disability and work, for example. So this was the framing in which we came up with the drivers of vulnerability. The first and overwhelming one was everyone is vulnerable when you're living under occupation, a military occupation. But nevertheless, beyond that, we can't stop at that statement. We've got to treat Palestine like you would any other country and look more carefully at, well, okay, but who is being left behind? Let's look a bit more carefully at what the story is behind the big numbers. We then developed a set of recommendations for our CCA that are very broad recommendations, and they're on your screen now, I hope. Or can you go to the next slide, please, Frederick? Around the data gaps, around opening ourselves up to new voices and the scrutiny of some of these vulnerable, disadvantaged groups that clearly were not very visible in our own programs over the years. To the need to develop, a much stronger political strategy around our development work, and so forth, and so on. So this is how we went around it. We started with an agreement on our approach, the idea of vulnerability and disadvantage being the big organizing idea. We then allowed the system to identify who those groups could be. We insisted they were backed by evidence, so it wasn't just a competition between mandates or the loudest voice at the table. We worked through, really in a collective way, what was going on here behind these indicators. How do we distinguish between a symptom versus a cause? And then we sat down, having made those decisions, and with the help now of some consultants for sure, we started to write up that story and lay it out in the CCA, and with a few recommendations at the end to sort of bring it to a tidy close. But of course, the whole purpose of the CCA is to set the stage for the UNDAF that follows. So let me just finish with a last thought on what we could have done better and where the challenges were. I've got 6 points where, and I'll finish on these, where I recognize some of the challenges even that we hit. I think the first challenge I would flag is that we don't have an analysis, a methodology for anticipating what may come in further down the track in terms of disadvantage and vulnerability. In other words, our analysis is based primarily on what we see now, rather than what may come tomorrow. And I think this is something that is a weakness we still need to figure out how to fix in future CCAs, but I'm aware of it. Second challenge, and it's sort of linked to the first, is that when you have such a strong sort of people-centered approach, it's quite awkward to accommodate some issues like climate change and environment, for example, where we had really was quite difficult to neatly integrate the climate change issues into this very people-centered analysis. Again, if we had a better methodology looking at what the future will bring, and in Nepal, for example, we actually did identify people at risk of a major earthquake with one of our groups, because we were a bit better, I think, in retrospect, at looking ahead at what the future may bring. The third challenge is the risk that our drivers become a bit generic. You've seen them: location, violence, the economic drivers, the political and socio-cultural drivers. There is some overlap with the Nepal one, not incidentally, but there's also some difference. I mean, geography and violence were much less prominent in the Nepali context. than in the Palestinian one. But I think there's always that risk that we'll find our way back to the 4 or 5 same issues. Hi, it's feeding back now. I'm hearing myself. Let me finish then on number 4. Sorry, something. No, that's better. Thank you. Number 4 is whether to make policy recommendations in a CCA. In a way, I think some people felt that we should go beyond just sort of highlighting some of these patterns and already prescribing solutions to that. And I resisted that because, A, it would turn the CCA into a massive amount of work and a massive document. And in a way, I also felt that this was the job of the UNDAF, to go deeper in terms of solutions. This was, let's draw a line somewhere, let's set the stage, and here's the problem, and use other tools to identify the solutions. Number 5, data gaps. If you're going to do a CCA and you're going to back your evidence with analysis, with empirical numbers, then by definition, vulnerable groups are probably fairly hard to to enumerate and back with numbers, because it's the nature of that vulnerability that no one's really looking. And so this is also a huge challenge to maintain the rigorousness of your methodology. And then finally, and this is perhaps the $500 million question, the challenge of making sure you translate your analysis in the CCA effectively into the UNDAF. And I can come back to your questions of how to make sure this analysis, which simply doesn't reflect the way we are organized in a UN country team, it doesn't reflect mandates, it's not the traditional approach. How do you make sure all of this finds its way effectively into an UNDAF and doesn't exist as a sort of separate document? So I will stop there with that explanation from the Palestine story and pass it back to you.
Thank you very much, Robert. This was very, very useful, and I'm also happy that you gave a little bit the background on the CCA. On how this is a different of a national plan, and kind of underlined the independence of the CCA, which is irrespective if you are a complex country or a regular country. There were quite a few questions on that, but that was I think you framed it very well. To not lose too much time, I will immediately give the floor to John Hedenström. I hope I pronounced that well. And he will be talking about the UN Strategic Framework for Lebanon. John, the floor is yours.
So much, Frederick, for offering me this opportunity to share, and thank you, Robert, for the interesting presentation, and thanks to the participants for your interest and engagement. Before the UN presentation, perhaps a few words about Lebanon to put you into the context. You might for the last 6 years, Lebanon has been at the forefront of one of the worst humanitarian crises of our time, which has exacerbated a pre-existing political security and economic shock and stretched the country to its limits. It's a post-conflict environment, and we have 3 different areas for the UN in the country, including 2 missions, one political in the form of UNSCOL, Special Coordinator, and a peacekeeping mission called UNIFIL. And then, of course, we have cooperation and with an emphasis on humanitarian support to handle the refugees crisis. If we can start with the first slide to go into the topic, what is the UNSF? The UNSF is a United Nations Strategic Framework for Lebanon. It's a 4-year strategy, 2019 to 2020. It meets the requirements of both an integrated strategic framework, an ISF, and the UNDAF. That means that it brings with it the features of an ISF in terms of focusing on a post-conflict environment or conflict environment, and also integrating the peacekeeping and the development or humanitarian activities. It is also comprehensive as the UNDAF is, and it's signed with the government and by the participating UN organizations. It's focused on peace consolidation objectives. It encompasses the range of political, peace and security, humanitarian, stabilization, human rights and development mandates and assistance strategies of the UN systems. It also outlines the UN's common approach and the expected contribution of the members of the UN family in support of Lebanon's security, political, human rights, and development priorities. Next slide, please. Thank you. In Lebanon, we have 25 UN entities, depending on how you count, but 23 of them are included and participating in the UNSF. The two missions, UNSCOL and UNIFIL, and agencies, funds, and programs who are present in the country. This is a whole of Lebanon approach. It should reflect a whole of Lebanon approach, which means that it's covering from south to north and tackling the multidimensional challenges that Lebanon is facing. Next slide, please. It is built on 3 pillars: peace and security, political stability and good governance, socioeconomic stabilization and sustainable development. And each pillar has 3 outcome areas, and the activities are organized under these pillars or these outcomes. And the vision is a secure, stable, and prosperous Lebanon exercising full sovereignty while respecting, protecting, and ensuring the rights of all. Next slide, please. So some words about the development of the UNSF. Of course, a necessary tool is the roadmap, but some of the building bricks or activities included in the roadmap were, of course, to build on lessons learned of the previous UNDAF in Lebanon, as in some other countries. I think the UNDAF was not used very actively. It was not a strategic tool for coordination and development, but it was something that was produced and then maybe forgotten about during the year. So the UNCT wanted to get beyond that and produce something that was more useful. So of course the production of the UNSF was built on some of the lessons learned from that previous collaboration. It was also built on the country situation analysis was developed in 2013, and of course also taking stock of the World Bank's country diagnostic in 2015. A desk review was produced about the development situation, and of course it was also something that was informed and produced in cooperation with key stakeholders by key validation moments with the government of Lebanon, but also with civil society and other actors. Next slide, please. Some of the challenges when producing this is obviously not only groundbreaking in Lebanon, but also a little bit unusual maybe in the UN system to include both peacekeeping parts of peacekeeping missions and the political missions into an UNDAF planning and design. So one of the key challenges was harmonizing in terms of harmonizing with already existing plans or strategies of the United Nations organizations. That was done partially through alignment of the UNSF to the existing plans and strategies, but also by organizations adapting if they had an opportunity to do so, their own plans and strategies to the UNSF objectives and priority areas. Another issue was humanitarian versus development in several ways. In one way, it was about balancing powers some of the humanitarian organizations had very substantial resources and also capacity to influence the process, and some of the smaller, sometimes specialized agencies had less resources to influence the production or design of the UNSF. But that was so efforts by the resident coordinator's office was necessary to balance interests and make sure that also the smaller or organizations with less capacity and resources were heard and were allowed to influence the design. Another challenge was the integrity issues, or the importance of independence for some of the organizations when it comes to signing something with the government, or even aligning with, for example, the peacekeeping mission and so on. But that was solved, and now I think it's a good. I think the different stakeholders in the UNCT are seeing this as a very useful tool for us to coordinate and to move beyond the concept of going from humanitarian to development, but rather focusing on humanitarian and development. And that is also something that we are facing now when we're going into processes for joint programming. Another challenge was the balancing of interests and powers, and I mentioned that before, so maybe I can leave it there. The LCRP was an existing tool. It's still there. It's the Lebanon Crisis Response Plan. It's a broader framework than the UNSF. It includes both United Nations organizations, but also other multilateral organizations and NGOs, INGOs, and the government. It's focusing on the refugees crisis, and it has a clear humanitarian character. So a challenge was that we would introduce a new tool, a strategic framework for the UN and the government, but with that we would use more proactively and in a strategic fashion. So there was some skepticism among some of the organizations working very intensively with the LCRP tool and the coordination efforts, the LCRP coordination efforts. So at first we were hesitant to commit and engage in something new that would demand not only work but also risk duplicating their efforts. That was solved by putting most of the UN LCRP interventions in the third pillar, the pillar about socioeconomic development, and also by aligning then at the later stage the output objectives to the output objectives of the LCRP to avoid too much duplication. Another thing was, of course, outcome overlapping. As always, when you produce something on the aggregated level, it is tricky to make sure that the outcome areas are complementary to each other and not too much overlapping. That was an issue that was not solved fully, of course. There are no perfect matrices, but it was a good enough solution for the UNCT, and but that was a challenge that they had to spend some time on. And of course also RBM approaches, how to make sure that we have the same approach to the basic RBM concepts and agree on a format that worked for all. Maybe another issue was the trickling down of information, as always in organizations, but maybe we should focus more on your questions now and open up also for if you have questions also about operationalization. I'm happy to answer that if we have time. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, John, for this very clear and brief presentation. I think that these are great presentations and quite complementary, one focusing on the CCA, the other one more focusing on the on the UNDAF, and I think you also highlighted a little bit the last challenge of Robert is like, how do we actually translate our CCA into a strategic framework, and it seems that you also had some challenges with that, so that was interesting to hear. I've already received a couple of questions, so I'll just start reading them out loud. The first question is for Robert, and this is from the Regional UNDG Secretariat in Asia Pacific, from Nina. And she writes, "Leave no one behind" is a lot about missing data, and by that I mean missing people who are intentionally missing. So it fundamentally becomes about the politics of who is included and who is excluded, and not sure we as the UN are ready to take that on. So what can we realistically aim for, given that we have this principle as the overarching UNDAF principle? Robert, would you like to take this? I propose that I just take question per question.
Okay, thank you. And Nina, thank you. Nina lived through some of the trauma of the Nepal CCA and UNDAF process, so she's a fellow traveler on these issues. So thank you for the question. I think this is a tricky issue. I think the answer is that we have to confront these issues head on. In the Nepal context, for example, we identified a number of vulnerable groups that the government was very uncomfortable with. One of them, most famously, was around people living in Nepal without citizenship. Very political issue to do with India and the next door and so forth. And we had another group around Muslim girls that were systematically, being left behind in terms of education outcomes. Very uncomfortable categories of vulnerability. We soldiered on. We included this in our CCA. It generated a tremendous amount of controversy. And in the end, when it came to the UNDAF, which was a government, at the end of the day, a joint document and has to be endorsed by the government, we had to drop one of those groups from our M&E framework, if you will, and that was the people without citizenship. The kind of categories around Muslim girls remain, but in the process, we drew a lot of attention to the issue. Our UNDAF and CCA ended up being the subject of editorials in the newspaper. It was a front page story in the newspaper that our UNDAF was being held up by the government for the following reasons. And that in itself was already part of the job we needed to do. So I think one is you need to soldier on and sort of grin and bear it. And two, if you don't have the numbers from government systems, which is the case, as Nina said, if you're not important, no one's counting you, then you need to rely on other robust data sets. They're not going to be the government census, but they're going to be credible analyses, and maybe really sort of sample-based analyses that the UN has done at different times, maybe with NGOs, but with UN involvement to the extent that you can stand behind these numbers. Are we ready for this? I think we have to be. I think what's beautiful about the Agenda 2030 is that, in a sense, there are no excuses will be accepted anymore. We have to. This is what Leave No One Behind effectively challenges us to do, and it's also, needless to say, synonymous with the human rights up front. I mean, these are all one and the same, or different sides to the same coin, and we need to do it. We had controversy in Palestine. The Israelis in particular were unhappy with the way we had framed the vulnerability that affects every Palestinian from the occupation. They complained in New York. The Palestinian government used CCA in a meeting in New York, which is where it got a lot of attention. And so, I think we've got to be strong enough to do it. But of course, we have to be careful that our analysis is robust, that we're not looking for controversy, that we're not picking fights because we like it. We want the attention. It's got to be done in a very judicious way. And we need the backup, of course, of our colleagues in headquarters at times. But that would be my short answer to what is a very, profound question.
Thank you. The next question is from Peter Ree, who has been head of the RCO multiple times and is now working as an independent consultant. And Robert, I'll give this question to you, but I'm also happy to add then afterwards on what's in the current guidance. Peter writes, I agree that the CCA is a UN document and represents the UN's perspective on development challenges in a given country. However, would you not need some sort of government validation or endorsement to proceed with using the findings for the strategic planning process? Over.
Yeah. So this is my I guess it touches nicely, or it links with Nina's point. What I didn't say is perhaps when I made my presentation, I talked about it as that the CCA sets the MNE baseline for the UNDAF that follows. Because this, for me, again, if you're doing your CCA well, you have a trove of data sets in your CCA which says, here are the people being left behind in this country. Here's why we think they're being left behind. And so effectively, you're making a statement, a value statement about the quality of the development trajectory in this country. And you are laying down a marker against which you want to be judged over the next 5 to 6 years as you embark on your new UNDAF. Now, the trick then is to make sure that two things transfer from your CCA into your UNDAF. The first is that the analysis, that in going back to figure out what is the driver that explains these trends and discrepancies, are they finding their way into our programming? You know, exposure to violence or socio-cultural attitudes in the Palestinian context. Are they going to find their way into FAO's programming in the agriculture sector? Are they going to find their way into UNDP's governance work? Or is it only going to be a kind of fringe activity in, in one of the UN Women programs? No, if it's a core driver affecting multiple vulnerable groups, it's got to cut across lots and lots of programs. So the first thing is to make sure you transition that analysis into your UNDAF design somehow. The second thing, the challenge, is to move the data set that says these vulnerable groups are disadvantaged and vulnerable, and here are the numbers that prove it. To make sure that you take that data and you use that as your indicator baseline for the UNDAF. And one way or the other, you make sure that the programs are going to move those needles. Otherwise, you accept that as a group, collectively, you have failed at the end of this UNDAF if these numbers have not shifted. Now, the problem there is not that you don't need the government. I mean, the government can reject some of these groups as you try and insert them into the UNDAF. They won't reject the analysis of drivers. They may be very sensitive about it when we talk about discrimination against disabled people and sort of prejudice against disability in a society like Palestine or Nepal. They're going to be uncomfortable about that, but it's pretty hard for them to reject it outright. They've signed conventions on disability. There's lots of ways of drawing them in. But they may indeed be able to spit out some of your indicators on your vulnerable groups. And this is what happened to us in Nepal with people without citizenship. We had to drop that. They wouldn't sign the UNDAF while we kept that in our indicator table as something against which we want to be judged. You've got to pick your battles. I think we did the right thing by including it in the CCA. I think we had to compromise as it came to the UNDAF. And I think that whole debate already empowered a lot of people to move that issue forward. And hopefully, next UNDAF, it'll be a very different environment when that issue comes up, because it surely won't have gone away. Thanks.
Thank you. And maybe just to add from our side, in the guidance, it explicitly actually mentions that the government should not necessarily endorse the CCA. And we've done that very much on purpose, because what we've seen from experience is that with the previous guidance, there were 3 options, and many of the UN country teams were just taking the national plan as their analysis, which of course is a good beginning point, but we had no idea, is the national plan actually reflecting the real issues in this country? So, and that's why we need to have that CCA to understand what are the real issues. And then the CCA is not only used as a tool to inform our next UNDAF, but it's also used as an advocacy tool with the government to highlight certain areas that are an issue that they might not recognize, that they rather not see. It's basically a way to convince governments of certain issues, especially if we have the underlying data under that. And that's made very explicit in the new UNDAF guidance. It doesn't mean that you do not have to involve your government when developing it. You should be involving a wide range of all stakeholders in the country, including the government, but not only the government. And that's exactly what we have tried to do. It's a kind of a safe space for UN country teams to discuss among themselves to see what are the real issues happening in this country to inform the own UNDAF. But in some cases, it might actually also inform the national plans in the country. So it's basically the difference. Do we try to have an influence over 1% of the money that the UN is bringing in the country, or do we actually try to influence 100% of the money that's being used in the country by also influencing the national plan? And that might be very ambitious, but that's a little bit also the background. I just wanted to add that. The next question.
Fred, can I add also, just to echo what you said, when we did our CCA, we had government people participating in the discussions, but they participated from ministries and so forth in a personal kind of expert capacity. We didn't put them into a position where they might be compromised in having to kind of endorse the recommendations. So I think it's a nice, happy way to compromise around that. Thanks.
Thank you. The next question is from Milica Turnic, I hope I pronounced as well, from UN Women Liberia, who says, extremely useful presentation, Robert, thank you so much. Very pleased to receive advice on the development of new UNDAF and CCA vulnerability drivers and the 5 million question. And then she also thanks John, and she is asking, could each of them comment on their approach and experience on gender mainstreaming? Maybe I'll start with Robert on this question, and then John afterwards.
Sure.
Okay, so we've got in our analysis on the CCA, as I mentioned, I think at one point, we did not stop with accepting gender and women as basically a vulnerable category, precisely because it was too big, and we wanted to get to a much kind of closer level of granularity. So amongst our 20 vulnerable groups, for example, included women exposed to gender-based violence, adolescent girls, food insecure households headed by women. So we were more precise in terms of trying to narrow down and unpack vulnerability, to better understand vulnerability and disadvantage. So I think that would be for the CCA itself, because I'm not talking about the UNDAF, but the CCA, that was a very deliberate decision to make sure that our analysis was granular enough that we could get to very specific drivers and understand the dynamics for women and for girls, in fact.
John?
Yes, thank you. Gender equality is mainstream strategic framework, but we also have a special outcome for gender equality, focusing more on the governance and advocacy activities. Up to the production of the UNSF in the operationalization phase, this was also a key issue. How we produce a joint program, or should we try to mainstream? So the decision is to revise the terms of reference for all the working groups, including then the gender work. And the results groups of the UNSF also proposed that the gender working group with a special assignment to analyze, review the joint work plan from a gender perspective, identify weak points, and suggest the ways to strengthen this joint work plan either through individual agents or through joint programs in different fields. It may be economic empowerment, or it may be rule of law, security or other issues that could be potential joint programs in the future.
Thank you.
I could add from the UNDAF, because we've now well advanced on our UNDAF design, was that when we got to our UNDAF, we've done two things. One, we've distributed these much more specific groups under the gender heading, like adolescent girls and food insecure, women-headed food insecure households. We've distributed those indicators across different parts of the UNDAF. And then on top of that, we have an outcome under our governance rubric, which is dedicated to the issue of discrimination on gender. So that's how we ended up in the UNDAF. But, I'll stop there.
Thank you. I'm just conscious of time. Robert, John, do you still have like another 10, 15 minutes?
That's fine, yeah.
Okay, good. Then we
it's
got like
very late for some people, so not for me.
Okay. We got like another 3 questions. A question for John from Ayana Bikulieva. What were the main lessons learned in Lebanon to use the UNDAF as a main strategic tool to align and coordinate the activities of the UNCT?
Can you repeat that? Sorry, I didn't hear the first question.
What were the main lessons learned in Lebanon to use the UNDAF as a main strategic tool to align and coordinate the activities of the UN country team? So the main lessons learned was of course that to make, if we produce a tool for coordination and strategic planning, it should also be used. So we need to focus on the usefulness of the tool. I think also to make sure that there is an inclusive process and that we emphasize on creating an ownership in the, not only on the UNCT management level, but also on the more technical level. That's still a challenge, and I think we are moving forward, and we have now a very good sense of ownership in the UNCT and also among some technical staff and deputies. But this is something that we need to work on through the strategy process in the UNCT. Thank you. Another question from Peter, and this is again for John. Was all humanitarian efforts, including the budget, included in the strategic document? If yes, how is this done considering the low degree of predictability on humanitarian emergency situations? So, yes, all humanitarian efforts should be in the UNSF. As much as possible, we should have use the UNSF as a comprehensive tool, and that is something that we now see when moving down to joint programming. For example, we are now to discuss joint programming in the field of economic opportunities, where we can then in a joint program possibly combine the type of cash for work support that the humanitarian agencies are offering, but combine it with more long-term investments, vocational training, decent job advocacy, etc. So this is it is combined, it is included in the joint work plans and also then later on in the joint programming. Thank you. Another question from Hugh McClaman from OECD, and that's probably a question that we could take a whole webinar for, so I'll just ask to highlight a couple of points. Can Robert or John talk through the challenges associated with developing an accountability framework to accompany the UNDAF plans? I don't know who would like to take this question first, Robert or John?
Well, I'm happy to do that if you want, but I think, shall I go ahead?
Yes, please go ahead.
I mean, it's a really difficult question. I think the first challenge is to make sure that it works as an accountability framework within the UN family. I mean, let's start there. This is the stuff that defines what we're going to do together, and by definition, if one of us lets the rest of the side down, we all fail. So firstly, I think you have to, unless you have the buy-in from the agencies, unless you have leadership for specific outcomes from senior agency staff that are decision makers who can make resource decisions, unless you are very clear about your indicators, your M&E indicators, and assigning responsibility for each number that is going to be measured to a different agency head who's going to take responsibility for tracking that number during the life of the UNDAF. Then firstly, then your accountability, your inter-agency mutual accountability is very weak. So that's the first challenge. I think the second challenge, as you broaden it out, is to remember that the resources that typically an UNDAF is launched with maybe 10 or 20% of the resources in the bank. So this is where we get very kind of in on very thin ice. You lay out a $1 billion ambition for 5 years, and you've got $200 million in the bank. And so the reality is that between you and that, and the outcomes you've set out over the 5-year period, is a tremendous amount of resource mobilizations and lucks and bad luck, or indeed a crisis like the Gaza war in 2014, which came in the middle of the last UNDAF for Palestine and completely took everyone off the UNDAF for the years that followed. I mean, the UNDAF was basically died the day that the first bomb was launched in July 2014. So there's a huge amount of unpredictability with UN financing. It's so different to the World Bank, which sets out a 5-year strategy and says these are the IDA numbers we're going to put behind it. The UN has a lot of fundraising to do before it can realize that. So the second big challenge on accountability we have to be realistic about is the fact that the picture is an aspirational one in a sense, financially. But the basic rules apply. You've got to keep it tight, you've got to keep it simple, you've got to keep heads of agencies engaged and not delegating. You've got to make sure that it's transparent and clear for the government to understand. And keep the resource picture in there, because I think some people feel now increasingly that because these numbers are a bit dodgy, they're aspirational, maybe you don't need the financial numbers in an UNDAF. I mean, I heard that in Palestine from some colleagues as well. But in fact, that really is you can't do that, because if you don't give a sense of scale, then your targets are meaningless in terms of accountability. And if you don't give a sense of the budget either, then you're not being very transparent with the government, whose endorsement, in a sense, you must have if you are going to access other people's development money. If you're doing that behind the government's back, it's never going to work. So simplicity, transparency, consultation, senior leadership, I think these are all some of the basic principles to get that accountability right. But it's a huge, huge challenge.
If I may add something, do you have time?
Please go ahead.
Yeah, so I agree that the internal UN family checks and balances, the discussions, the critical discussions, the sharing of information is a very good tool for accountability. Of course, we also have high hopes that the new UN info system would allow us to also make our data more transparent to the public. That would also be an important step forward for accountability. And of course, the steering committee opportunities with the government and also the pillar groups or the result groups are supposed to also be organizations for dialogue with the government in a more organized fashion, would also potentially promote accountability through that dialogue.
Thank you. The last two questions I will just take together because they're very similar. The first one is from Christian Lotz, who works in South Sudan in the RCO. How do we plan in situations with a high degree of uncertainty? How do we describe and operationalize scenarios and risks? And a question that's associated with that is from Nina from the Regional UNDG Secretariat in Asia Pacific, which is specifically to John. In a complex country situation, the situation on the ground is changing constantly. So how do you ensure that your UN strategic framework includes constant risk assessment to adapt programming? Maybe John, I'll ask you to answer first. This is about risk assessment and risk management.
Okay, with regards to the risk issue, that's of course a very critical one. It's often forgotten about and maybe not handled thoroughly, but what we're looking into now is to produce some kind of risk management framework to allow us to systematically follow up on certain risks. It would also make it possible for us to not only do this on maybe an annual or semi-annual frequency, but also to have a couple of generic risks that we have identified and that we have updated that we can use also for joint programs or other tools that we need. And so that we will not duplicate the risk assessment too much. So that's one thing that we are doing in the field of risk. When it comes to planning and uncertainty, I think that's definitely the case for us as well. So we need to have a flexible approach, not only to revise the, for example, we will have semi-annually reviews to take a look at the progress of interventions, and also then, of course, see if we need to make adjustments, etc. But also on the annual level, we can decide on changing outputs, adjusting the direction of some of the outcome areas if we need to. So of course this should be a flexible tool. We need to be open for changes, and we need to be risk aware, and we also need to be a little bit more systematic than maybe in a more stable environment.
Thank you. Robert, do you want to add something to this?
I guess two statements. One, don't do an UNDAF when the environment is so unpredictable that it's not really doesn't pay off. It's a tremendous investment of time. And if you don't have a stable government, if you don't have a plan on the government side to harmonize with, then the UNDAF exercise is pretty shallow. So if your government isn't able to tell you what they don't know what next year will bring, then frankly, if they haven't even got around to laying out that vision because they're so preoccupied fighting fires, then it's probably a proxy indicator that this is not an UNDAF country, and you should be using a separate tool and not kind of, stand up to the, the system and say, no, okay, we need something different right now, and we'll revisit this every year until we come into more calm waters. I think that's the first thing. The second thing is to learn from the Palestinian experience, where we completely, the UNDAF disappeared with the beginnings of the war in Gaza because it was so all-encompassing. That was only 18 months into, I beg your pardon, that was 6 months into the UNDAF, and we had this. And so, really, you do have to think about those scenarios and what you would do. And I mean, in the countries we're talking about together today, this is a reality, and so you need to build maybe some buffers and some mechanisms into that. Let me finish on this point, because I was really in two minds. It's possible we get another conflict in Gaza, of course, and the question in my mind was: should we, in order for the UNDAF not to become irrelevant, should we build into the UNDAF design a kind of placeholder for reconstruction work if there is some kind of conflict in the years ahead during the life of this UNDAF, so that it stays relevant to what the future might bring? And I thought, no, we really cannot pretend that rebuilding houses that have been destroyed by missiles is development. We cannot pretend that. We need to do everything we can to prevent that happening. But if that happens, this is not development. This is setting development backwards. This is the opposite of development. And the notion that you would somehow accommodate those sort of risks, accept those kinds of risks as a natural part of keeping the UNDAF relevant, somehow didn't feel right. Thank you.
Thank you. And maybe just to add from my side, in the new UNDAF guidance, one of the elements that we really have strengthened is the annual review process. Also, joint work plans have been strengthened, and one of the basic ideas there is actually to kind of take stock of what really has been done. We did have discussion, should we have an update of the common country analysis on an annual basis? Now that was seen as a little bit too excessive, but that's why you got this annual review where the results groups actually take stock, like what we have in the CCA, does this still make sense? Has the situation has been changing? And of course, in countries like Lebanon and Palestine, those situations change a lot more than in more stable countries. But that's why an annual review process is so important. And we just have seen that in many countries it hasn't been done that serious in the past. So that's another way of assessing if the situation has still been the same. And again, don't make it a huge process, just do a light review if that's the best way to do it in your country, adapt it to what makes sense in your country. So don't go overboard either. And with that, if there's any questions that were not yet answered, we'll be happy to get in touch directly with you. But since we're already a little bit over time, I propose that we conclude here. I would like to thank Robert and John again for this great presentations, great examples. I hope it was useful for colleagues to hear these two examples. You will get the presentation through the Coordination Practice Network. If you are not a member yet, feel free to send me an email and we will add you. And if you were registered, you will automatically get a recording of this webinar in your mailbox today or tomorrow. Robert, John, I don't know if you want to say any last words before we conclude, but again, a big thank you, and despite the fact that you are both traveling and not in your duty station, a huge thank, and also thank you to the technological fact that it didn't break down, even you were not at your duty station. Robert?
No, great. Very pleased to participate. I hope it was useful. Thanks, Frederick.
Yes, thank you, Matt. Thank you very much. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for those colleagues. Next week we have another UNDAF webinar, and this time we will be talking about UNDAFs in high middle income countries or high income countries, and we will be talking about the case of Costa Rica and Botswana. So I hope to hear you or see you then again, and wish you all a good morning, good afternoon, or good night wherever you are. Have a great day. Bye.